The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as I pushed my cleaning cart down the empty hallway of Lincoln Elementary, the familiar squeak of the wheels echoing off the lockers. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. 20 years ago, I'd walked these same halls as a student, never imagining I'd return as the janitor everyone barely noticed. But sometimes life has a way of bringing you exactly where you need to be, even when you don't realize it at first. It was a Tuesday afternoon when everything changed. The dismissal bell had rung an hour earlier, and most of the kids had rushed out to waiting buses and cars, their voices fading into the distance. I was making my usual rounds, emptying trash cans and wiping down surfaces, when I noticed a small figure still sitting at one of the picnic tables in the courtyard. 7-year-old Sophie Martinez sat hunched over a piece of paper, her tongue poking out slightly in concentration as she worked with a broken crayon. I'd seen Sophie around school plenty of times. She was one of those kids who always said hello, even when other children barely acknowledged my existence. Her mother Lisa worked double shifts at Murphy's Diner across town, which meant Sophie often stayed late at the after-school program. What caught my attention that day wasn't just that she was still there, but the intensity with which she was drawing. David Thompson had grown accustomed to being invisible. At 42, he moved through Lincoln Elementary with the quiet efficiency of someone who understood that his job was to maintain the background of other people's important moments. The children saw him as a friendly face who fixed broken desks and cleaned up spills. Their teachers appreciated his reliability, and the administration valued his punctuality. None of them suspected that the man who emptied their trash cans had once commanded boardrooms and signed contracts worth millions of dollars. The decision to work as a janitor hadn't been born from necessity, but from a deep exhaustion with the corporate world that had consumed 15 years of his life. After selling his software development company for an amount that ensured he'd never need to work again, David had discovered that financial freedom felt surprisingly hollow when you had no one meaningful to share it with. His ex-wife had taken half his fortune in the divorce, along with their young son who now lived 3 states away and called him only on birthdays. The penthouse apartment and luxury car had felt like monuments to loneliness rather than success, so he'd walked away from it all. Not dramatically or publicly, but quietly, like a man slipping out of a party where he'd never quite belonged. He'd moved to Cedar Falls, a small town where nobody knew his history, rented a modest 2-bedroom house on Maple Street, and applied for the most honest job he could find. Being a janitor meant helping people in small, tangible ways. It meant being useful without being important, present without being noticed, valuable without being celebrated. The work brought him a peace he'd never found in conference rooms or strategy sessions. There was something deeply satisfying about restoring order to chaos, about leaving spaces cleaner than he'd found them. The children treated him with the casual friendliness they reserved for adults who weren't trying to teach them anything, and their innocence reminded him of parts of himself he'd forgotten existed during his years of calculated business decisions and profit margins. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Sophie Martinez had always stood out among the students, not because she was particularly loud or disruptive, but because she possessed an unusual kindness that seemed to radiate from her like warmth from a campfire. While other children rushed past him in the hallways, she would pause to ask how his day was going or to share some small observation about the weather or a book she was reading. Her mother Lisa worked grueling hours to support them both, and David had noticed how Sophie never complained about staying late at school or eating cafeteria meals when her lunch money ran short. That particular Tuesday afternoon, David found himself pausing longer than usual as he watched Sophie work on her drawing. She was using a stubby red crayon to add details to what appeared to be a family scene, her small fingers gripping the crayon with the determination of an artist working on a masterpiece. The setting sun cast long shadows across the courtyard, and David realized she'd been working on the same picture for over an hour. Curiosity finally overcame his usual practice of respecting the children's space. He approached the picnic table slowly, not wanting to startle her or interrupt her concentration. When she looked up and saw him coming, her face broke into one of those genuine smiles that children give before they learn to be self-conscious about their expressions. The drawing she'd been working on showed a simple house, with 3 stick figures standing in front of it. 2 smaller figures clearly represented Sophie and her mother, but the third figure was taller, wearing what looked like a janitor's uniform, complete with a name tag and cleaning supplies. At the top of the page, written in careful 7-year-old handwriting, were the words, "My perfect dad." Sophie held up the drawing with obvious pride, explaining that it was for Father's Day, even though the holiday was still weeks away. She'd drawn her perfect father as someone who worked hard with his hands, someone who helped people and made things better, someone who wore simple clothes but had a kind face. Without hesitation, she folded the paper carefully and handed it to David, telling him that he was the closest thing to a perfect dad she could imagine. The moment stretched between them like a bridge spanning an impossible distance. David felt something shift inside his chest, a recognition of connection that he'd almost forgotten was possible. Here was a child who saw value not in wealth or status, but in daily acts of service and simple human kindness. She'd created an image of her ideal father figure and recognized those qualities in a man the rest of the world considered ordinary. As David accepted the drawing with hands that had once signed multi-million-dollar contracts, he realized that Sophie had given him something far more valuable than any business deal he'd ever negotiated. She'd given him a vision of the man he could become, not through accumulation of wealth or power, but through authentic connection and genuine care for others. The invisible janitor had suddenly become visible to someone who mattered, and the feeling was both humbling and transformative. That evening, David sat in his small living room, studying Sophie's drawing with the same intensity he'd once reserved for market analyses and profit projections. The simple crayon lines seemed to contain more truth about success and fulfillment than all the business books that filled his forgotten storage unit across town. The drawing remained folded in David's wallet for 3 days before he worked up the courage to approach Sophie again. He'd found himself thinking about her words constantly, replaying the moment when she'd looked at him and seen something worthy of admiration. The image of himself as someone's ideal father figure felt both impossible and desperately appealing, stirring emotions he'd buried beneath years of professional detachment. On Friday afternoon, David discovered Sophie sitting alone in the library during lunch period, carefully reading a picture book about space exploration. Most of the other children were outside playing or gathered in the cafeteria, but she seemed content with her solitude and her stories. He'd noticed this pattern before but had never considered intervening. Today felt different. David approached her table with the careful movements of someone unused to initiating personal conversations. When Sophie looked up, her face brightened with the same genuine warmth she'd shown when giving him the drawing. Without preamble, she launched into an enthusiastic explanation of the book, describing astronauts and planets with the passionate intensity that only children could bring to subjects that captured their imagination. As she spoke, David found himself genuinely engaged in a way he hadn't experienced since his own son was small. Sophie's curiosity was infectious, her questions thoughtful beyond her years. She wanted to know if people could really live on Mars, whether aliens might be friendly or scary, and why space was so dark when the sun was so bright. David discovered that his years of technical background had prepared him to answer many of her questions in ways that satisfied her scientific mind while encouraging her natural wonder. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sophie Martinez, who had come to pick up Sophie early for a dentist appointment. David had seen Lisa around school during parent conferences and volunteer events, but they'd never spoken beyond polite hellos. She was younger than he'd expected, probably in her early 30s, with the kind of determined expression that came from carrying responsibilities that should have been shared. Lisa's reaction to finding her daughter deep in conversation with the school janitor was complex. David could see her protective instincts engage immediately, followed by confusion as she processed Sophie's obvious comfort and enthusiasm. When Sophie excitedly introduced David as "my friend who knows about space," Lisa's expression softened slightly, though wariness remained in her eyes. The interaction was brief, but significant. Lisa thanked David politely for keeping Sophie company, her tone suggesting both gratitude and uncertainty about appropriate boundaries. As they prepared to leave, Sophie turned back to ask David if he would eat lunch with her again next week, a request that made Lisa's eyebrows rise with surprise. David agreed, feeling both pleased and nervous about the commitment he was making. Over the following weeks, these lunch conversations became a regular occurrence. David found himself looking forward to Sophie's questions and observations, with an anticipation that reminded him of feelings he'd thought were permanently lost. She had an unusual gift for seeing beauty and possibility in ordinary things, pointing out patterns in floor tiles, wondering about the stories behind lost buttons, imagining adventures for the classroom pets during weekends. Through these conversations, David began to learn about Sophie's life outside school. She spoke matter-of-factly about helping her mother with household tasks, about eating cereal for dinner when money was tight, about the small apartment they shared above the hardware store on Pine Street. There was no self-pity in her descriptions, only the practical acceptance of a child who understood that families came in many different forms, and that love mattered more than luxury. David's knowledge of Sophie's circumstances awakened protective instincts he'd forgotten he possessed. When he noticed her shoes were developing holes, he found himself researching children's shoe stores and wondering how he might help without overstepping boundaries or injuring pride. When she mentioned that her mother worked late shifts and missed school events, he felt a familiar anger at systems that forced good people to choose between financial survival and being present for their children's important moments. The urge to solve these problems with money was almost overwhelming. David's bank account could have eliminated the Martinez family's financial struggles with a single transfer, could have provided Sophie with every educational opportunity and material comfort she might need. But his years of wealth had taught him that throwing money at situations often created more problems than it solved, and his brief interactions with Lisa suggested she was the type of person who would be deeply uncomfortable accepting charity from a stranger. Instead, David found smaller ways to help. He began timing his custodial work to coincide with Sophie's after-school hours, ensuring she always had someone to talk to while waiting for her mother. He started keeping educational magazines and interesting books that he'd found for her to take home. When Sophie mentioned loving art but not having supplies, David discovered that the school had a surplus of materials that needed to be organized and distributed to students who might benefit from them. These gestures were careful and subtle, designed to provide assistance without drawing attention to the economic disparities between their circumstances. David was acutely aware that his secret wealth created an invisible barrier in their relationship, a fundamental dishonesty that grew more uncomfortable with each passing day. Yet he couldn't bring himself to reveal the truth, fearing that knowledge of his financial resources would change the authentic dynamic they'd established. Lisa's attitude toward David began to evolve as she witnessed the positive impact of their friendship on Sophie. The child came home from school more animated, filled with stories about space exploration and questions about science that Lisa couldn't answer. When Sophie started expressing interest in astronomy and asking to visit the library to find more books about planets, Lisa recognized that David's influence was encouraging her daughter's natural curiosity in ways that their limited resources had made difficult. The turning point came during a particularly difficult week when Lisa's car broke down, and she had no reliable transportation to pick up Sophie after school. David noticed Sophie waiting long past the usual pickup time and gently asked if everything was okay. When Sophie explained the situation with the matter-of-fact resilience she always displayed, David offered to wait with her until her mother could arrange alternative transportation. When Lisa finally arrived, nearly 2 hours late and clearly stressed from having to negotiate complex public transportation routes, she found Sophie and David engaged in an impromptu science lesson using items from his cleaning cart to demonstrate basic principles of physics. Her daughter was laughing and asking questions, completely unbothered by the delay that had caused Lisa such anxiety and embarrassment. Lisa's gratitude was genuine, but complicated by her obvious discomfort at being in a position where she needed help. David recognized the pride and independence that made accepting assistance difficult for her, emotions he understood from his own experience of rebuilding his life after his divorce. He was careful to frame his presence as simply doing his job rather than going out of his way to help, allowing Lisa to maintain her dignity while ensuring Sophie felt supported. That evening, Lisa found herself thinking about the school janitor who had shown such unexpected kindness to her daughter. There was something unusual about David Thompson, though she couldn't quite identify what made him different from other school employees. He spoke to Sophie with genuine respect, answered her questions with patience and knowledge that seemed deeper than what his job would require, and carried himself with a quiet confidence that suggested hidden depths. Meanwhile, David drove home that night feeling more connected to purpose than he had in years. The simple act of waiting with Sophie, of providing steady presence during a moment of uncertainty, had reminded him of the profound satisfaction that came from being genuinely needed. His corporate success had never provided the sense of meaningful contribution that he found in these small acts of service to a child who saw him as someone worthy of admiration and trust. As the weeks passed, David found himself increasingly invested in Sophie's well-being and development. He began researching educational programs and opportunities that might benefit a bright child from a single-parent household, careful to gather information without making commitments that might reveal his true financial situation. The knowledge that he could provide Sophie with every advantage money could buy, while being constrained by the necessity of maintaining his assumed identity, created a tension that grew more difficult to manage with each passing day. The relationship between the three of them was developing into something that felt increasingly like family, built on daily interactions and genuine care, rather than formal obligations or biological connections. David had found the sense of belonging he'd been searching for since his divorce, while Sophie had gained the father figure she'd drawn in her picture, and Lisa was slowly beginning to trust that some people could be relied upon without expecting anything in return. Yet beneath the surface of these growing connections lay the fundamental deception of David's hidden wealth, a secret that threatened to undermine everything they were building together. Each day that passed without revelation made the eventual truth more complicated and potentially devastating. But David found himself unable to risk losing the most authentic relationships he'd experienced in years by admitting to the very success that had left him feeling so profoundly alone. The photograph appeared on the front page of the Cedar Falls Tribune on a Wednesday morning, capturing a moment David had never intended to be public. Someone had snapped a picture of him and Sophie building a volcano for her science project in the school courtyard, their heads bent together in concentration as they carefully measured baking soda and vinegar. The accompanying article was meant to be a heartwarming feature about community connections, but for David, it represented the beginning of everything unraveling. Marcus Whitfield recognized David's face immediately. As CEO of Pinnacle Industries, Marcus had competed against David's software company for 3 major contracts before David sold his business and disappeared from the corporate world. The sight of his former rival working as a janitor struck Marcus as either the most spectacular business failure he'd ever witnessed or something far more intriguing. Either way, it was information worth investigating. Within 48 hours, Marcus had confirmed David's identity and discovered the truth about his financial situation. The revelation that David Thompson, who had sold his company for $47 million, was voluntarily working as a school custodian while maintaining a modest lifestyle, struck Marcus as bizarre enough to be worth exposing. He began making discreet inquiries among their mutual business contacts, sharing the story as an amusing anecdote about how the mighty had fallen. The rumor spread through Cedar Falls' small business community with the speed that only gossip about the wealthy could achieve. David first became aware of the exposure when Principal Richardson called him into her office on Friday afternoon, her expression a mixture of confusion and concern. She had received several phone calls from parents asking whether it was appropriate for their children to be spending time with someone who might be suffering from mental health issues serious enough to cause such a dramatic career change. The questions were polite but pointed. Why would a millionaire choose to work as a janitor? Was this some kind of publicity stunt or social experiment? Could they be certain he was mentally stable enough to be around children? Principal Richardson assured David that she had complete confidence in his character and performance, but she was obligated to address parental concerns and needed to understand the situation herself. David found himself in the impossible position of having to explain decisions that had seemed perfectly logical in private but appeared inexplicable when exposed to public scrutiny. His desire for meaningful work and authentic connections sounded hollow when filtered through the assumptions of people who measured success solely through financial achievement. The principal listened with professional sympathy, but David could see her struggling to understand why someone with his resources would choose custodial work over retirement or philanthropy. The conversation was interrupted by an urgent knock on the office door. Lisa Martinez stood in the doorway, her face flushed with anger and confusion. She had heard the rumors circulating among other parents at Sophie's soccer practice, and had come directly to the school demanding answers. The woman she had begun to trust with her daughter's emotional well-being was apparently harboring secrets that called his entire character into question. Lisa's confrontation was more painful than the principal's professional concern because it was personal and emotional rather than administrative. She felt deceived and manipulated, wondering whether David's friendship with Sophie had been genuine or some kind of twisted entertainment for a bored millionaire. The possibility that she had allowed her daughter to become attached to someone who might be playing elaborate games with their lives struck at her deepest fears about protecting Sophie from disappointment and exploitation. David's attempts to explain his motivations only seemed to deepen Lisa's suspicion and anger. His talk of seeking authentic connection and meaningful work sounded like the self-indulgent philosophizing of someone who had never faced real financial hardship. How could he understand the struggles of working families when he had millions of dollars sitting in bank accounts? How could their friendship be genuine when it was built on fundamental deception about who he really was? The confrontation escalated when Lisa accused David of treating their lives like a social experiment, of finding entertainment in the gratitude and affection of people he could help or hurt according to his whims. Her words cut deep because they echoed David's own fears about his motivations, forcing him to confront the possibility that his desire to help might be tainted by the very privilege he was trying to escape. Sophie's arrival at the school office, sent to find her mother by a concerned teacher, brought the adult argument to an abrupt halt. The 7-year-old looked between the 3 adults with the intuitive understanding that children possess when they sense their world shifting in dangerous ways. Her confusion and growing distress reminded all of them that their conflict was taking place in front of the person who had the most to lose from its outcome. Lisa's protective instincts overwhelmed every other consideration. She gathered Sophie quickly, informing David that he was no longer welcome in their lives and instructing the principal that her daughter was not to have any contact with him during school hours. The rejection was swift and absolute, cutting off the relationship that had become central to David's sense of purpose and belonging. The drive home was conducted in silence, with Sophie sensing that questions would not be welcome, but clearly struggling to understand why her friendship with David had suddenly become forbidden. Lisa's anger was compounded by her own sense of guilt for having allowed the relationship to develop without adequate investigation into David's background. She had failed in her primary responsibility as a parent to protect her daughter from potentially harmful influences. That evening, Sophie finally broke down in tears, demanding to know why she couldn't see David anymore, and whether she had done something wrong to make him go away. Lisa found herself in the impossible position of trying to explain adult concepts of deception and class differences to a child who only understood that her friend had been taken away without explanation. Sophie's grief was pure and devastating, uncomprehended by the social complexities that had destroyed the relationship. Meanwhile, David sat in his small living room, staring at Sophie's drawing of her perfect father, realizing that his attempts to build an authentic life had been undermined by the very wealth he had tried to leave behind. The money that was supposed to provide freedom had instead created a prison of suspicion and misunderstanding, making genuine human connection nearly impossible. The business community's reaction to the revelation ranged from amusement to bewilderment, with former colleagues and competitors speculating about David's mental state and motivations. Some saw his career change as evidence of a midlife crisis or breakdown, while others wondered whether he was planning some kind of comeback or investment strategy that they couldn't yet understand. None of them considered the possibility that he might simply be seeking happiness through different values than the ones that had driven his corporate success. Marcus Whitfield, satisfied that he had exposed what he considered to be either fraud or instability, continued to spread the story as entertainment at business gatherings and social events. The narrative of a successful entrepreneur reduced to janitorial work appealed to people's sense of schadenfreude and their need to believe that great wealth automatically guaranteed happiness and fulfillment. Principal Richardson found herself in an increasingly difficult position as more parents demanded explanations and assurances about David's continued employment. While she personally believed he was an excellent employee who posed no threat to students, the growing controversy threatened to become a distraction from the school's educational mission. She scheduled a meeting with the school board to discuss the situation and determine whether David's employment should be terminated to avoid further disruption. The school board meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday, giving David 5 days to decide whether to fight for his job or simply disappear from Cedar Falls as quietly as he had arrived. The prospect of losing his work at the school meant losing his last connection to the life he had tried to build, but staying would require publicly defending choices that seemed increasingly difficult to justify to people who measured worth through conventional metrics of success. David spent those 5 days in a state of profound isolation, cut off from the relationships that had given his life meaning and facing the possibility that his experiment in authentic living had been doomed from the start. The wealth that had been intended to provide options had instead created barriers, making it nearly impossible to form genuine connections with people who would always question his motives once they knew the truth about his financial situation. The irony was not lost on him that Sophie's innocent drawing of her perfect father had initiated a chain of events that would ultimately separate them, destroying the very relationship that had made him feel worthy of the title she had bestowed upon him. His secret had been kept to protect their connection, but its revelation had made their separation inevitable, leaving him more alone than he had been before their friendship began. 6 months had passed since David last saw Sophie Martinez, and the absence felt like a physical weight he carried through each day. He had resigned from his position at Lincoln Elementary before the school board meeting could take place, choosing to leave with dignity rather than force a community debate about his worthiness to work around children. The small house on Maple Street had become a refuge where he spent his days reading, thinking, and trying to understand how his pursuit of authentic connection had led to such profound isolation. The Cedar Falls Community Center's annual talent show seemed like an unlikely place for redemption, but David found himself drawn to the event by restless curiosity and the hope of glimpsing the life he had left behind. He purchased a ticket and chose a seat in the back row, wearing a baseball cap and casual clothes that would help him blend into the crowd of parents and community members gathered to support local children's performances. The gymnasium buzzed with nervous energy as families claimed seats and children peeked through backstage curtains, adjusting costumes and practicing their acts one final time. David scanned the program and felt his heart skip when he saw Sophie Martinez listed among the performers, scheduled to present a science demonstration about solar systems. The knowledge that she was pursuing the astronomical interests they had discussed together brought both joy and sadness, reminding him of conversations that had sparked her curiosity about the universe beyond their small town. When Sophie took the stage, David barely recognized the confident young presenter she had become. At 8 years old, she moved with purpose and spoke with clarity as she arranged a model solar system, explaining planetary orbits and the relationship between size and distance in space. Her presentation was sophisticated for her age, demonstrating research skills and public speaking abilities that suggested significant growth during their months apart. But what struck David most powerfully was the moment when Sophie dedicated her presentation to "My friend David, who taught me that the universe is full of wonderful mysteries waiting to be discovered." The simple acknowledgement, delivered with the sincere gratitude that only children could express, reached across 6 months of separation and touched something David had thought was permanently damaged by their painful goodbye. The audience responded to Sophie's presentation with enthusiastic applause, but David noticed that Lisa Martinez, sitting in the 3rd row, seemed less celebratory than the other parents. Her expression was thoughtful and perhaps regretful as she watched her daughter's obvious passion for astronomy, a subject that had become central to Sophie's interests after their conversations with David. The connection was impossible to ignore, and Lisa appeared to be grappling with complex emotions about the role David had played in nurturing her daughter's intellectual development. After the show ended and families began gathering in the lobby for refreshments, David intended to leave quietly without risking an uncomfortable encounter. His plan was derailed when Sophie spotted him near the exit doors and broke away from her mother to run toward him with unrestrained joy. The reunion was spontaneous and emotional, with Sophie throwing her arms around David's waist and talking rapidly about everything she had learned about space since they last spoke. Lisa's approach was more cautious, her expression guarded but not hostile as she joined them near the exit doors. The months of separation had given her time to reflect on the situation with more objectivity than had been possible during the initial shock of discovering David's deception. Watching Sophie's obvious happiness at seeing David again, combined with her daughter's continued enthusiasm for subjects he had introduced, had forced Lisa to reconsider her harsh judgment of his motivations and character. The conversation that followed was awkward but necessary, conducted in the lobby while Sophie chattered excitedly about her science projects and her dreams of becoming an astronaut. Lisa acknowledged that she had reacted emotionally to the revelation about David's wealth, letting her fears about exploitation and manipulation override her observations of his genuine care for Sophie. She admitted that her daughter had struggled with the sudden loss of their friendship, frequently asking questions about David's disappearance that Lisa had found difficult to answer honestly. David seized the opportunity to explain his decisions more clearly than he had been able to during their painful confrontation at the school. He spoke about the emptiness he had felt despite his financial success, his genuine desire to find meaning through service and connection, and his regret about maintaining the deception that had ultimately destroyed their trust. His words were careful and humble, acknowledging Lisa's right to protect her daughter, while expressing his hope that they might find a way to rebuild some form of relationship. The breakthrough came when Sophie, who had been listening to the adult conversation with the serious attention children reserve for discussions that might affect their happiness, asked David directly whether he had stopped being her friend because she had done something wrong. The question exposed the heart of the matter and reminded both adults that their conflict had created confusion and pain for the person they both cared about most. David knelt to Sophie's eye level and explained gently that he had never stopped being her friend, that adults sometimes made mistakes that hurt relationships, and that he had missed her every day since they stopped spending time together. His honesty about adult failings and his visible emotion as he spoke seemed to convince Lisa that his feelings for Sophie were genuine, regardless of the circumstances that had complicated their friendship. The decision to allow supervised contact was made gradually over the following weeks, beginning with brief meetings at public locations where Lisa could observe the interaction between David and Sophie. These careful encounters allowed all three of them to rebuild trust slowly, with Lisa gaining confidence in David's intentions, and David proving through consistent behavior that his interest in Sophie's well-being was authentic and enduring. During these supervised visits, David made a conscious decision to be completely transparent about his background and resources. He explained to Sophie, in age-appropriate terms, that he had been successful in business before choosing to work at her school, and that he had enough money to help people but preferred to do so through friendship rather than charity. This honesty extended to Lisa, who gradually learned about David's business history and his reasons for seeking a different kind of life after his divorce. The revelation about David's failed marriage and limited relationship with his biological son added context that helped Lisa understand his attachment to Sophie. She began to see their connection not as a wealthy man's experiment in slumming, but as a divorced father's genuine need for family connection, and a lonely child's need for a stable male figure. The realization that they were filling emotional voids in each other's lives made their relationship seem more balanced and less potentially exploitative. As trust slowly rebuilt, David found himself able to offer practical help in ways that felt natural rather than condescending. When Sophie expressed interest in attending a summer science camp that was beyond Lisa's budget, David was able to sponsor her participation through a scholarship program he established at the community center. The indirect nature of the assistance allowed Lisa to maintain her dignity while ensuring Sophie could pursue her interests. The summer camp experience was transformative for Sophie, exposing her to advanced scientific concepts and connecting her with other children who shared her intellectual curiosity. She returned with increased confidence in her abilities and clearer goals for her education, developments that validated David's belief in her potential and demonstrated the positive impact that careful investment in gifted children could achieve. Lisa's own perspective began to shift as she witnessed the ways David's support enhanced Sophie's opportunities without undermining their family independence. She started to appreciate that his wealth could be a resource for her daughter's development rather than a threat to their relationship, provided it was offered with respect for their autonomy and dignity. The transformation in their dynamic was marked by increasingly natural interactions and shared decision-making about Sophie's education and activities. David's input was sought and valued rather than imposed, while Lisa's expertise about her daughter's emotional needs guided their collaborative approach to supporting Sophie's growth. By the end of summer, what had begun as supervised visits had evolved into a genuine co-parenting relationship built on mutual respect and shared commitment to Sophie's well-being. The initial deception that had nearly destroyed their connection had been replaced by radical honesty and transparency that created a stronger foundation for moving forward together. David realized that his months of isolation had been necessary for understanding the difference between helping from a position of privilege and contributing as an equal partner in a relationship. The lessons learned during their separation had prepared him to engage with Lisa and Sophie in ways that honored their independence while offering meaningful support for their shared goals and dreams. 2 years later, David stood in the backyard of their new home, watching Sophie adjust the telescope he had given her for her 10th birthday. The modest 3-bedroom house on Elm Street represented a compromise between his resources and Lisa's desire to maintain some independence. a place where they could build their unconventional family without the weight of excessive luxury overshadowing their daily happiness. Lisa emerged from the kitchen carrying hot chocolate for their evening stargazing session, a tradition that had evolved from Sophie's continued fascination with astronomy. The sight of his wife moving comfortably through their shared space still filled David with wonder at how naturally their separate lives had merged into something beautiful and complete. Their wedding 6 months earlier had been a small ceremony at the community center, attended by friends who had watched their relationship evolve from suspicion to partnership to genuine love. Sophie's excited voice broke through his reflection as she successfully located Jupiter through the telescope lens, her enthusiasm unchanged from their first conversations about space exploration years earlier. Now, however, her questions were more sophisticated, reflecting the advanced classes she attended at the Regional Science Academy that David's scholarship program had helped establish. Her academic achievements were impressive, but what mattered most to David was that she remained the same curious, kind-hearted child who had seen potential in a lonely janitor. The scholarship program had grown beyond their initial vision, now supporting dozens of students from working families throughout Cedar Falls. David had discovered that using his wealth to create opportunities rather than solve immediate problems felt more sustainable and respectful of family dignity. Lisa managed the program's day-to-day operations, bringing her understanding of community needs and her talent for connecting with families who might otherwise be suspicious of offers that seemed too generous. Their marriage had surprised many people in Cedar Falls, but David no longer cared about public opinion in the way that had once driven his decisions. The man who had built a corporate empire through careful attention to appearances had learned to value authenticity over perception, choosing actions based on love and commitment rather than social expectations. Lisa had taught him that true partnership meant sharing both struggles and successes, while Sophie had shown him that the most meaningful legacy was measured in relationships rather than financial achievement. David's former business associates occasionally expressed bewilderment at his lifestyle choices, unable to understand why someone with his resources would choose suburban domesticity over luxury travel and elite social circles. Their confusion no longer bothered him because he had found something they would never recognize as valuable. He had a daughter who sought his advice on everything from science fair projects to friendship troubles, a wife who challenged his ideas while supporting his dreams, and a community role that felt genuinely useful. The telescope revealed Saturn's rings that evening, prompting Sophie to launch into an explanation of planetary formation that demonstrated her growing expertise. As David listened to her confident voice describing cosmic phenomena, he remembered the drawing she had given him years earlier and realized that he had become the father figure she had envisioned, not through wealth or status, but through consistent presence and unconditional love. Lisa joined them on the deck, pointing out constellations she had learned to identify during their weekend camping trips. These simple family moments had replaced board meetings and corporate strategy sessions as the highlights of David's calendar, providing fulfillment that no business success had ever approached. He had discovered that the most important investments were made with time and attention, rather than money. As they prepared to go inside, Sophie hugged David goodnight with the casual affection of a child who had never doubted her place in his heart. The security she felt in their family had allowed her to flourish academically and socially, developing into a confident young person who understood both her exceptional abilities and her responsibility to use them thoughtfully. Later that night, as David and Lisa sat together planning Sophie's upcoming science camp experience, he reflected on the journey that had brought them together. The drawing that had started everything was now framed in Sophie's bedroom, a reminder of the moment when a lonely child's vision of her perfect father had transformed 3 separate lives into an inseparable family. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.